Hi class, it is Dr. Linder. Welcome back. In this short video, we're going to be looking at how does blood and oxygen and glucose and all nutrients, how does it get up into the brain from the heart? And the key term when we talk about the brain, you're going to be hearing the word circle of Willis. Okay, circle of Willis. So let's start with coming off of the heart. Now we're looking at the right side, right? If you look at this individual, right, they're looking that direction. So this side of the face is the individual's right side. That's important. So when we start labeling these things, although they're not labeled here, to get these correct, everything but the brachiocephalic will have the word right in it, okay? Because there's really just a brachiocephalic trunk or a brachiocephalic artery. There really is just one brachiocephalic trunk, and it's the one on the right side. So it doesn't need a right or a left delineation. It just doesn't. Whenever you have the same, then you have to go left and right. But since there is no brachiocephalic on the left, we just call it a brachiocephalic trunk. Now, from the brachiocephalic trunk, there will be a right common carotid. Now, anything that has the word common in it, we said will divide. What will it divide into? It will divide into an internal and an external something. So the right common carotid will divide into a right external carotid and a right internal carotid. It's the internal carotid that has this dilated portion right here called a carotid sinus, and that's there to measure blood pressure. It has these baroreceptors inside to alert the neuroendocrine system what it needs to do to try and lower blood pressure so these blood vessels don't rupture or have an aneurysm or the individual doesn't stroke out. So here's the internal carotid. Here is the external carotid. And off the brachiocephalic trunk, we also have, very important, the right vertebral artery. And if you look at the vertebral artery, it's traveling through the transverse processes. C1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? C1 through C6, the transverse processes. If you think back to osteology, there was a hole in those transverse processes called the transverse foramen. So the vertebral arteries travel through there. And then on the bottom of the skull, there's a hole on the occiput called the magnum foramen or foramen magnum. The arteries have to find a way to get through that large hole on the base of the skull in the occiput, the magnum foramen, to feed blood and oxygen into the brain. Okay, and it does so by becoming the basilar artery, which I'll show you in just a second. All right, what else do we have here? So that's what we're going to focus on. And then just to review, we can see the subclavian artery and the axillary artery right here. All right, so now let's take a look at the circle of Willis. What this view is looking at, kind of like an inferior view of the brain, looking at it from underneath. And we know that because we can see the cerebellum here, and we can see the medulla right here, and we can see the pons, and we can see the cerebellum right here. Let me just erase this and make this a little bit clearer. Let's make that blue. So here's the medulla oblongata, and then this portion here that's larger is pons. So you have medulla, pons, here's the cerebellum, posterior. The rest of all this is the cerebrum, right? We just have different parts of the cerebrum. We have an anterior, middle, and posterior. So now that that's established, let me clear that up. Let's erase this. And let me Change it back to blue, dark blue. So here are the vertebral arteries. There's one on each side, right? There's one here and there's one here. Those vertebrals come in and join, they fuse, and they form what's called a basilar artery. That basilar artery is what kind of sneaks in into that magnum foramen. Okay. Now, from the basilar comes in. Before things get too busy here, I also want you to see the internal carotid here that's been cut and the internal carotid here that's been cut. Okay, so they're coming in and they're going to find a way to feed blood into this circle right here. It's kind of like this nice collateral circulation. So you have vertebrals coming in, bringing blood into this circle. And then you have the internal carotids coming in that can bring blood into the circle. All right, so you have vertebral arteries, basilar artery, and now think of the brain as like an anterior, middle, and posterior, okay? So we're going to have an anterior cerebral artery, a posterior cerebral artery, and we're going to have a middle cerebral artery. So anterior cerebrals going to the anterior part of the brain, that's this and this, right? You have them on both sides, this and this, that's anterior cerebral. Middle cerebral, all of this, that's all middle cerebral. And then posterior cerebral is everything back here, posterior cerebral. So then there's only two other arteries left. It's called the anterior and posterior communicating artery. So here is the posterior communicating artery. If we look at it, it's this, and it's this. And then we find the anterior communicating artery, which is quite small. It's just this. It's that little arc that's connecting both anterior cerebrals, okay? So let me erase everything here and we'll start again. So we have the basilar vertebral arteries first, both sides, they come in, they form the basilar artery. The basilar artery, if it comes up, the first one coming off, you could see here, it's the posterior cerebral. There's the posterior cerebral. Here is the middle cerebral. And here is the anterior cerebral. All right, if you take a look at it, you'll see one's going to like the frontal lobe, one's going more to like the temporal lobe and parietal lobe, and then the other is going more posterior, more towards the occipital lobe. Let's not forget about the internal carotid arteries, and then the anterior and posterior communicating. So here's the anterior communicating, and here's the posterior communicating. Okay, that is the circle of Willis. Each of these arteries feeds different centers of the brain that you learned back in neurology. There's a speech center, there's a movement center, there's a sensory cortex, a motor cortex, there's a visual cortex, smell cortex, and this is why when people have decreased blood flow or glucose to the brain for extended periods of time and these neurons within the brain start to die, they lose function. Based on the function that's lost, they can tell what structure has been damaged because structure determines function. If someone has lost their ability to speak, then we know that the issue is most likely on the left-hand side. Language, speech, math, linear thinking. Right-hand side is more artistic and creative. If someone does have a stroke on the left-hand side of the brain, they become hemiparetic or hemiparalysis on the opposite side of the body, on the right-hand side of the body, okay? So you should review the internal carotids, the vertebral arteries, the circle of Willis, right? Understand the basilar artery, the correlation between the internal carotids and the basilar, kind of feeding into that anastomosis where they all come together and join, called the circle of Willis. Understand carotids, vertebrals, the posterior cerebral arteries, the posterior communicating arteries, the internal carotid artery, the anterior cerebral, the middle cerebral, the posterior cerebral, and then the anterior and posterior communicating arteries, okay? So vertebrals, they come together, they form the basilar, then the basilar comes in, posterior communicating, posterior cerebral, middle cerebral, anterior cerebral. In that circle, you have the two internal carotids cut. And then you have your anterior communicating and posterior communicating arteries. Those are the biggies. When we come back, we'll get into the trunk, talk about the abdominal section. So hang on.